Grab a brew, listen up, and get back to you. This is Things I Wish I'd Known podcast.
Hello and welcome to Things I Wish I'd Known with your host, Rachael Welford, the podcast where we create positive change in your life through having interesting conversations. And today I am with Michelle Agopsowicz, and she is a Reiki master. She does social work. She's studied disabilities. She basically is incredible, and she works with people on healing trauma, which, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you will know is something that is very, very close to my heart, because she believes that trauma is universal, really. We've all experienced trauma, and sometimes we might think that somebody else is worse than ours, or maybe that wasn't a traumatic thing, but Michelle really believes that it's universal, and she approaches everything with this trauma-informed perspective, which I think is really refreshing, and helps people to create wellness and balance through integration of both kind of traditional counselling and mindfulness techniques, as well as other tools and stuff that she's just built up over time, and obviously throwing in all the learnings from Reiki and everything else in there as well. So thank you so much for being here, Michelle. It's really great to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. Me too. So the way I love to always start at the beginning, because rarely does somebody that works with trauma go, oh yeah, there's no story here. And I know that you have shared that, you've sort of suffered with autoimmune disease, you've had trauma, you've experienced anxiety. How did all that stuff start? Like, take us back to the beginning.
Yeah, I think what happens too, Rachel, for a lot of people is we often think trauma is this one big thing that happens. Mine was not that necessarily. It was cumulative over time. All of these things that also at the same time started to create my coping strategies as a small person, and all the ways that it just sort of formed my personality. So
Yeah.
I think I've always been an empath, a highly sensitive person who's kind of sponged up everybody's stuff and never known what mine was and what other people's was. So I grew up in a small town where I never felt like belonged. So it was a town of about, 500 people or so.
Yeah.
And I had a few people in there, but I never felt like I really entirely belonged there. And so I think that also laid down the foundation of a trauma in many ways, because I went to school with the same few people for, kindergarten to grade 12. And so for this whole period of time, there were lovely, lovely people in my life, but I never really felt like I landed there. So for the first 18 years of my life, there was lots of bullying and just a sense of not feeling like I belonged, that I was somehow dropped here, that I didn't have the same sort of ideals or the ways of seeing the world that other people saw. So that wouldn't, and I consider that a trauma because my system was overwhelmed for 18 years in that way.
Yeah. I think so many people, I agree, think, trauma is, I don't know, a world event, or some kind of major catastrophe, like a big flood, or a car accident, or, witnessing a death, or, suicide, all these kinds of things that generally people would go, oh God, are you okay? Big assaults, physical assaults, or sexual assault, these kinds of things. It's like, actually, a lot of the time trauma can come from, like you say, prolonged, ongoing, stressful situations, whether that be at home or at work, feeling like you not belong. I mean, you saying that just resonates so much with me. I remember literally for years when I was a kid, I used to think I was an actual alien. I just thought, I don't know, I don't feel like these people. I don't know.
I feel like the stork dropped me like in the wrong location or something, right? So
by accident, like beam me back up. What the hell is going on in this planet?
And so what this happens is, I think, is in my mind, the stress and trauma are the same thing. Because it's anything that overwhelms your system, and it's anything that gets stored in your system. And so then on top of this sort of 18 years of not quite being sure whether who I was okay in the world. My dad has had type 1 diabetes his entire life. He lost his eyesight when I was 3.
Wow.
And so while that might that was something that at the time I did not consider a trauma. It was just the way it was.
Yeah,
My
of
family's
course.
pretty normal and healthy, and for the most part in that way. But to a 3-year-old, in reflection, I'm like, okay, but that wouldn't have made sense to a 3-year-old.
No.
Right. And so it really, I think it laid down some of the foundation for me feeling like I needed to be a people pleaser and a perfectionist. And I think some of the anxiety really got rooted in
Yeah.
that place. And then there was multiple events going forward where my dad had strokes and other things that we've dealt with over time. So I've also faced his death throughout my life, even though he's luckily still here.
Yeah.
And then when I was around grade 5, grade 6, there was a sexual assault encounter at that point.
Right.
And so then that also, what happened is bullying really started happening at the same time. And this is funny how trauma works. So in my mind, the bullying is actually still worse than the sexual assault, because in my mind, they all knew the sexual assault had happened, and that's why they were bullying me, even though nobody knew, nobody could tell. But in my little 12-year-old brain,
Yeah.
I thought everybody can see that I've done something wrong and something has happened to me.
Everybody knows. And
Everybody
that's a
knows.
horrible fear, isn't it? Everybody knows.
Yeah, everybody knows. Yeah.
But none of them did know.
None of them did know. But in my mind, this was the story, the trauma story I started to create about this.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? Because I also think, and I don't know how much research there is to back this up, to be honest. So this might just be my opinion for anyone that's listening. Take it or leave it. But in my experience, the times when I've been most vulnerable is where I've been more likely to have a traumatic event happen.
Yeah.
And I do think that sometimes, if you think about perpetrators that are looking for victims, however you want to dress that up for whatever the crime is going to be or the traumatic event is going to be, they're not looking for super confident people that are fully supported, that have got their shit together, that have really secure boundaries, who, walk with a skip in their step and have this kind of like confidence about them, are they? They're looking for people who maybe look like they can't defend themselves or look already like something. So it's interesting that, you've had this event happen and then the bullying is kind of concurrent with that, because maybe, and this is 100% not victim blaming at all, but when you've had a traumatic event happen, things change, you stand differently, like it resets your nervous system, it resets how you view the world, you're hypervigilant, you're all these other things happen, and people pick up on that, whether it's conscious or not, and therefore you're probably more likely, unfortunately, that in the one point probably where you need people to scoop you up and say, hey, Michelle, like, are you okay? It's like actually they see a vulnerability.
And I constricted, right?
It.
And this is like absolutely the origin of like lots of my gut issues, lots of the other things that became chronic. And my anxiety had always been there as a sensitive person, and that it just went through the roof. And my coping strategy was to be high performing, because I think this is the other thing about trauma is people think, oh, traumatic people who had trauma are homeless and have addictions and all of the, which is true.
But also, why are they homeless and why do they have addictions?
Exactly. And why do they have mental health? And there's all these things are just a symptom of trauma.
Yeah.
But what also is a symptom of trauma is, like, for me, perfectionism, anxiety, people pleasing, some of these other trauma symptoms we don't necessarily say, as well as high achieving. So in order to feel control in my world, I could be really good at caretaking. I could be really good at like academics. I could be really good at these other things. So I think there's also the other side of the people who take that trauma and then run with it by never allowing themselves to relax and keep going. And
I think it's called is it called post-traumatic growth syndrome or something like that? So I think there's actually a phrasing for it where people kind of go, right, rather than it breaking them, they're kind of like, right, okay, let's
but I think before they transcend the trauma and say I'm going to do something with it, there's lots of coping strategies that maybe 100%. Aren't quite at that post-traumatic growth yet.
100%.
Because I think post-traumatic growth is probably what came later for me in terms of making meaning of these events.
Yeah.
and understanding what it did to my system and how it got stored in my body and all of these things, right?
And it's interesting what you shared as well, because I'd love to just touch on this, because I talk about this a lot with my clients. I work with some people that have experienced, pretty hefty traumas, and similar things happen. Like you said, I view the bullying as almost worse than the sexual assault. And it's like, because it depends how your brain and your body have registered that event. So you might have, there's I'm trying to remember which book it's in now. It's a really interesting study about these two people that were in the same car accident and how their brains and bodies registered the car accident. And it was a really bad, they were both very lucky to survive the accident. And one of them hadn't registered it as trauma at all. They were so unbelievably grateful that they couldn't fathom that when they looked at that vehicle and then looked at their body and were like, how am I here? What? And so it kind of didn't even register as trauma, because for them it was like this incredible event.
Right.
I survived it. And the other person had complete PTSD, hypervigilance, anxiety, couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. Like all of their system was completely, because they couldn't believe they were in this accident, and it completely terrified them. So it doesn't really always matter what the event is.
No.
It
And I think
matters
this
how
is-
your body and your brain
Yes.
register it.
It's not what happened, it's what happened next. And then it's how our body
Yes.
stores it. And then it's the story that we tell about it. And
Yeah.
it goes to show you, this is one of the mysteries of the universe. We haven't figured this out, why the brain and the body works in this way. Like psychology, medicine, like we know what the nervous system does, we know what the brain, but we don't really understand, why do some personalities end up being okay and other personalities don't? Why does it make a growth situation for others? Why doesn't? For me, I'm incredibly grateful that no matter what happened, I knew I was loved within my family. And I think that just buffered
I agree.
so many things. Although if you fast forward into my 20s, my anxiety got worse. I had body dysmorphia. I had food issues. I had stomach issues. And I just generally hated myself. There was like no ounce of self-love in there. And then when I got into my 30s, I was diagnosed with the autoimmune condition. And this was my post-traumatic growth moment because it shook me up in such a way, because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to die because of this.
Can you share, because I'm not 100% sure with autoimmune because there's so many different autoimmune conditions, isn't it? How does that represent? What were you experiencing when that happened?
So it actually came completely out of the blue for me. And I'm happy to say today that when I go get my blood work, all my markers are back in the complete normal range.
Yes.
And I think that was because it was a wake-up call. I was like, okay, I'm not going to hate my body anymore. I'm going to learn how to live in my body. I'm going to learn how to be grounded. I'm going to learn how to deal with the anxiety. I'm going to learn how to deal with the stress. So that was a huge period of real darkness in my 30s as I was trying to sort that out. But I'm really happy to say that in my 40s, I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm good. And it hasn't progressed any further. I'm back in the normal range, but there absolutely is connection with autoimmune conditions and trauma because it's an inflammation response. So it's autoimmune happens for people within trauma. Sometimes some people also just genetically get autoimmune conditions, and so you also don't have to think why did this happen? You don't have to. For me, I absolutely knew it was because I didn't love myself, and I'd hated my body long enough that my body said no more. You've stored this trauma for too long. And mine all happens in the gut. So like all of my processing happens through the body. That's where I store it. And so it really depends kind of who you are and how that presents itself. Myself, I really didn't have any symptoms other than lots and lots of years of chronic, like leaky gut stuff. So when I got my physical results back and they were like, you got to go to rheumatologist, I was like, what the heck is happening? No, I'm fine. So it wasn't that I was pursuing that I didn't feel good.
I think gut stuff's really interesting as well. Like I hear this quite a lot. I'm very lucky, actually. I generally can eat, give or take, pretty much whatever I want, and my gut's pretty, even really spicy food or whatever. But I think gut issues are really funny because for most people they're like, oh, it's always been like this. oh, it's just how it is. Oh, I shouldn't
Yeah.
eat dairy, or you know, it's only when I eat this particular thing, and that's not that often, or whatever. And it's like, but if you were bleeding out of your eye, but only when you use mascara, like you're probably going to stop using mascara, or like,
Yeah.
oh, it's only happens like 3 times a month, so it's cool. And you're
Yeah.
like, you're bleeding out of your eye, man, you know, but because you can't really see it, and
Yeah.
it, you know, it might be a bit annoying, but it's kind of, people don't
Yeah.
necessarily always pay attention, but there's such big links between gut health
There
and
is,
everything else in the body.
because when you're stressed, your system's constantly pumping out cortisol. So your gut never gets to heal or gets to settle. I think it's such a good point too, because culturally, we also get told, like, this is where collective trauma comes in. Oh yeah, that gut thing's pretty bad, but power through.
Yeah, or just take a Rene.
Just, just,
Everybody gets acid reflux, or
yeah,
everybody
just,
gets diarrhea here and there,
yeah,
and everybody gets this, or or is
yeah,
constipated or bloated
yeah,
or whatever. And it's like,
yeah.
do they?
Yeah. Yeah. And then when we have trauma, we also get to, we abandon our needs too, right? So it's like,
Mm,
well, I have this thing, you just live with it.
yeah.
Right. But that's a trauma symptom in itself, isn't it? Because you're not saying I'm important enough to actually
Yeah, and also I think it's
look
an
at what that
energy thing.
is.
Like
It is a huge energy
how
thing.
much energy you spend. Like, I was in hypervigilance when I had PTSD for literally years,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so, but I didn't know that's what I was doing. I just,
Yeah.
that's just was my normality. And you don't realize how much energy it takes to be scanning every
Yeah.
single, minute, not even minute, like seconds of scanning people's facial expressions, scanning people's body language, scanning the room, making sure you know where the exits are. Does that window open? Is that thing, has that been,
Mhm.
it's like how much cognitive load is being
Yeah.
utilized in just trying to make sure that you feel safe. Then on top of that, you've got to then go, oh, I've got this gut thing, and now I need to go and see maybe a doctor, or I need to go and get
Mhm.
some kind of thing, or I need to watch what I'm eating. But actually, I'm so stressed and vigilant
Yeah.
about everything that, shopping is really difficult anyway. And then I don't want to
Yeah.
think about what
Mhm.
food I'm eating, or that I'll just grab whatever's quick
Yeah.
and simple.
Yeah.
And it's this
Or I
whole,
want to be comforted, and the comfort foods often irritate gut. But and then you
I
also make a
love
really good
comfort
point.
eating.
You make a really good point about the like cognitive fatigue too, because it's not just something happens to me, like it's happening energetically and spiritually. It's
Mm,
happening in our body. It's happening in our thought process. It's
it
happening in how
affects
we lead in the world. It's
everything.
everything. It's completely holistic. And I think so many people also say, well, I actually never considered that car accident or that sexual assault, or I never actually, or the traumatic death of somebody having
Yeah.
suicide or mental health. So many people tell me, they're like, well, I never named it as trauma. And what my passion is like, to me, trauma seems like this really big scary thing, but to me it's completely destigmatizing. So
Mm,
when we can have this conversation about trauma, it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's not that you did something. It's that something happened to you. And so to me, then the addiction, the mental health, the gut issues,
mm,
the autoimmune condition, however it shows up for you, then isn't about blaming yourself on what you did and what happened.
no. Or
It's
what you didn't
suddenly
do.
what you didn't do. It's suddenly like, oh, I have a name for this experience. And so I think
Mm,
people think, oh, it feels like a really big, scary word.
yeah.
But I think it takes its power away when we name it as trauma, and we can name it as a thing. And people go, oh, I never recognized it as that.
And especially when you share, like, definitely I've had this with certain clients, it's not just fight, flight, freeze.
Yeah.
It's fight, flight, freeze, fawn.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the, people pleasing, or, is
Yeah.
appease the threat. And a lot
Yeah.
of the, like, if you didn't do anything, it's because you froze. And actually, a lot of the time, if you look at, how your nervous system's been programmed, if you're the kind of person who had to be quiet and wait something out because you weren't so sure
Mm-hmm.
what was going to happen, or you didn't know what mood someone was going to be in, or you didn't know if you were going to get hit or whatever, and you live in that environment for a really, long time, and then you come out as an adult into the world, and some years later, your boss reacts in a similar way to how maybe that parental figure did, and you just freeze. that's because it's learned behavior. It's not because you did something wrong and you couldn't stand up for yourself, or you weren't clear on your boundaries, or it's because that's how your nervous system has learned that you can survive situations like that. And so then you can start to go, oh, and again, you release that self-blame and stop going, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? Well, because you've got, when you go into that space, you've got no control. Your body's going to go, this is how we're going to survive. This is how we're going to survive. And actually, then you can go, my body made the right decision because I'm still here.
Yes, because it's also
having this conversation.
Yes, and it's a brilliant strategy. So that's what I like to tell people too. Like, you might not like the anxiety, but at the time it was a beautiful strategy that kept you safe. You might not like your overuse of substances, but it was a beautiful thing that kept you safe at the time. You've just outgrown it. And it takes a while to get back into it. And I also don't want to think, I think the other thing we think about within trauma is you'll heal it, you'll unpack it, and then you'll never be triggered again. You'll be healed and everything will be fine. Sorry, people. Humanity, right, is such that you have to face it over and over again. But then I want to add another one, but outside of the fight, fright, flight, freeze, fawn, is that we're also capable of flow. And we can be in that flow state. And even if we default back to fawn, mine's fawn, when we get into a stress response, we can also then figure out how to get back out of that stress response and get back into flow. But flow also isn't something you don't live in flow either. We have thousands of emotions a day. Thousands of stress responses and thousands of flow responses in a day. But we tend to, but we're also programmed, really, when we all lived in caves and things, right? We really only need to pay attention if a bus is about to hit us. We don't need to pay attention to the times when we're feeling really good.
No.
Right? But that's why gratitude and mindfulness practices too is nice, because it brings us back to actually being able to look at the beauty and safety around us in this moment. Because that hypervigilance, you're right, that hypervigilance overtakes everything. And then the only thing left, for me anyways, the only energy left is like, well, I'm going to go have a nap. I'm going back to bed.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. And I think also for a lot of people, when you've been feeling completely numb, because it's easier not to feel anything than it is to feel all this stuff. And then you've got to feel it to heal it, and it starts coming in and it's terrifying, or you have done a lot of trauma work. This was definitely in my experience. I did loads of, I've done so much therapy now. It's hilarious. But you come out the other end and you have that period of time where you're like, this is awesome. Oh my God, I'm so happy. I can feel things. I'm joyful. I'm relaxed. I can relax. Yes. And then it's like, oh, okay. But then something happens in life.
Yeah.
Because you get a little bit triggered and you go, oh my God, it's happening again. And there's that fear of just falling all the way back down into that pit, which rarely happens. It's just like, you've got to remember there's like this whole plethora of feelings, and you're going to feel all the things, and it's okay.
Yeah. And then we have to figure out how to befriend our feelings and have it be okay to feel it, to heal it, and to say, okay, so I'm feeling this feeling, but actually if I stay with it, even for just a little bit of time, even just name it, and then move on, it doesn't get stored in the same way. And then it also takes a little while after you've done, your work, and you've done the bulk of the work, you get triggered again. It takes a few triggers before you can trust it. You're like, okay, I actually can get stressed without going into full panic attacks anymore.
Yeah.
But it probably took 10 years to trust that it wasn't going to result in a panic attack.
Yeah. And even when it's like, I remember one time, it was so random. I hadn't had a panic attack in years, and, and I wasn't even thinking about it. I was at the gym and this thing happened that was very similar to the trauma, and I got completely transported in a second. And I just was like, and I started going into a full-blown panic attack, and I was just laying down on this bench, with weights in my hands, and I thought, shit, you need to get up and put these weights down. For a start, you're going to clock yourself in the face. And as soon as I kind of sat up, I had this observer piece of self that went, oh, you're about to have a panic attack. And that's because this happened. It's not actually, there's nothing happening now. You're completely safe. You're in the gym. And I was able to almost like flip it on its head and not have and I didn't end up having it was like the starting of one, but I didn't end up having this full blown panic attack. And I remember in that moment thinking like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah. And I think this is,
cool.
And I love that you mentioned this, Rachel, because I think this is what it is. It's not like we're going to get triggered.
Yeah.
But to me, mindfulness and healing and being in a place where it feels like it's integrated enough, it's good enough for the moment, is this meta perspective where it's like, I can watch myself going into fawn. It's like, oh, I can actually see myself stepping towards the people pleasing.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can say, okay, Michelle, you're doing that, so maybe don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm like, oh, you're walking right into it. Here we go.
So funny when you do that.
And then you're like, oh, I'm still watching myself make this choice to walk right into this pattern. And that's okay. And then what happens is self-compassion, self-forgiveness. To be like, yeah, I did that thing. And being able to, this is a thing I never thought I'd be able to get to. And then laughing at it.
Yeah.
And being like, oh yeah, I did that thing.
I'm doing that thing again. Yeah.
Right. But I think when all of ourselves are integrated, we can watch that hypervigilant self. We can watch the anxious part of us. We can watch the protector part of ourselves and the manager part of you have this meta perspective. It's so, I love that you shared that story because it's like, oh, I'm watching myself.
I actually love it because, and also just giving yourself a break. Like as long as it's not, super harmful behavior, right? Yes. Like if you're watching yourself walk into just like using heroin again or something like that, like probably don't.
Yeah, probably don't.
What if it's like, oh look, I'm watching this pattern of myself, I'm just going to say yes to something that I probably should have said no to just for ease, or like my personal one, which is super more common than I'd like to admit. Oh, I'm just going to watch myself comfort eat a tub of ice cream.
And it's like, I watch myself driving to the store, having the like, maybe I should stop for some chocolate. No, you don't need chocolate. No, I'm going to stop. Well, maybe I also need milk. So if I happen to find myself getting milk, maybe chocolate would happen at the same time.
Yeah. I'm here for it as well. We're like, oh, I need to get loo roll. No, you don't. You're trying to get ice cream. Like, stop lying to yourself. Then you're like, oh well, if that's my coping mechanism today, that's okay. And it could be, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
I would love to know what's one piece of advice, like if you could go back and kind of speak to Michelle, who was kind of really suffering and had experienced this trauma, and like, you don't really need to know much about trauma to know that if you're being sexually assaulted at 12 years old or younger, it's going to have a major effect on lots of different areas of your life. What might you say to her?
Well, the first thing I would, and I think this is maybe sounds pretty standard, but I would just wish I had some semblance that I was lovable and that I could love myself and that I was okay. And I think I had this profound moment in therapy when I was actually trained, because I'm trained in EMDR. So I was training to do EMDR. And when you're training to do EMDR, you were actually processing, learning. Somebody else is doing therapy when you're learning.
That is well intense.
And I was processing while I'm actually learning. And I burst out laughing around the sexual assault. Because I was like, oh my God, like, shit, this has nothing to do with me.
Wow, what a realization.
And I burst out laughing because I was like, I was just there and available. It actually had nothing to do with who I was.
Wow.
And it had everything to do with them. It had nothing to do with me. And I found it hysterical. I had tears running down my face of like relief, but also humor around this, that I'd held this for so long that somehow there was something wrong with me that had happened. And I think that's so common.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what I love about EMDR and tapping in the other like body and mind processing things is that I in that moment, I got a different story.
Yeah.
And so through that, then it sort of unfolded this like, oh my God, I could rewrite what I've believed about myself, that I wasn't worthy, that I could love myself, that it was safe to be seen in the world, because of course my strategy within the bullying and everything was to just disappear as much as possible. And so then it was like, I can I have a voice and I can be seen in the world, and I can survive if people don't like me. I still don't like that. That's still a trigger for me. Like, I still want everybody to love me and everything I say and all of those
Yeah.
things. But I have something to say and it's okay. And so I think I wish I hadn't spent so much time hating my body. But of course I
Yeah.
also blamed my body, right?
Yeah.
Wanted to hide my body. And so it was just this epiphany of, you're lovable, you can love yourself, and that's beautiful, and everybody has a right to that.
Yeah.
Like,
And that you
everybody
don't
is not
actually,
special and also incredibly beautifully special at the same time.
yeah, and that you don't really need anyone else's like permission or validation for that either. Because I
Yes.
think for a long time, I mean, me and my body have had a really interesting journey anyway. I think there's still stuff that I'm working on and unpacking that I probably will be forever. I don't know. I don't
Me
want
too.
to actually, I don't want to limit myself like that. I'm sure I'll get over it at some point. But I do feel like it was almost, I would want somebody else to give me either permission that I was beautiful, or that I had an acceptable body shape, or that I wasn't fat, or that, you know, and then I would go, oh, okay, I can maybe. But now I'm really starting to realize, like, you don't need anybody else to do trauma work. And I've been working on this planner, which I don't. It's been a nightmare project. Anyway, we won't go down that route. Just start whinging on my podcast. But anyway, part of the planner, it's called Review, Release, Renew, and it's a process that I've been doing for a number of years, and I've ran it in the membership in Happy Habits Club, and it's super popular. And part of it is around forgiveness. And forgiveness, I think, is a really interesting topic that I myself massively misunderstood, and I think is also generally misunderstood in the world, because you don't need anybody else for forgiveness.
No. And I also don't think there's necessarily a really good English word for it, because it gets us really trapped up. And I sometimes talk about this idea of toxic forgiveness.
Yeah, because it's like as if you're going to like let someone off the hook. Like, you know, whoever assaulted you, right? There's no way that you're going to, well, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but it's unlikely that, you know, if you've had that experience at any point, you're going to go, oh, that's okay, no problem.
Right.
You know,
And
it's
so,
like,
yeah.
it wasn't okay that happened, but I actually don't need to forgive you in that sense. I don't need your input in terms of, I don't need you to apologize. I don't need me to do anything. All I need to do is let go of the emotion that I'm holding on to. And like you said, that story that I'm holding on to, that I'm bad, I did something wrong, it was something wrong with my body. There's, you know, potentially, I mean, again, I don't want to put emotions in your, but I imagine anger, frustration, resentments, shame.
And in my family, anger's not a big thing. So then it gets translated to anxiety. So if I'm sad, I cry. If I'm happy, I cry. If I'm angry, I cry. So I also don't think I ever really had any languaging around anger, because anger wasn't an expression, and that goes into that fawn response through family
repressed
lineage,
rage,
because we inherit all these things too, right?
I don't get angry. I used to say that for
right?
years.
And so the thing is too, because most of my family has a fawn and freeze response, we're all really conflict averse too, right? And so then there's not really any of this. So you get this, okay, so then anxiety, just everything shows up as anxiety for me. And then there's this toxic forgiveness of like, oh, I didn't, you know, I'm over it. It doesn't bother me. I haven't, you know, and I think it just bypasses. It's the same as toxic positivity. It bypasses, which then links into this idea, which I've been playing with, because I'm still trying to get better at anger and actually saying, yes, I have that human emotion.
Yeah.
So one of the things that helped me to look at that is think about it as sacred anger.
Oh.
So there are things in the world and things we experience as humans that we're supposed to be angry about. It's not okay that people get sexually assaulted. It's not okay that we have war. It's not okay that we do these things to each other.
Or physically assaulted, or
anything, right? It's not okay.
Or
it's not okay that you're neglected as a child. Anything. None of that is okay. And so I think if you think about it as, this helped me at least, I don't want to say that it's going to help anyone else, but this idea that But if it's sacred anger, to me, it's like this vessel you can hold in this place of, okay, but anger is the appropriate response right there. But
Yeah.
most of us have this experience like anger is scary and out of control. It doesn't have to be scary and out of control.
No,
And it doesn't have to be hidden either.
I think it's an interesting thing, because what I try and share with my clients a lot is every single emotion is valid.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not a problem if it's the right response to the thing that's happening. So, you know, for example, it may be that actually laughing at the fact you were sexually assaulted might seem like the incorrect response, right? That's the same thing as like getting anxious about something that shouldn't be anxiety inducing. Okay. And it's like, okay, so if we're experiencing, you know, rage fits or, you know, really extreme anxiety based on like how I used to, if I had to leave my house, right, that shouldn't give me a panic attack. Opening my front door should not be an event that gives me a panic attack, but it used to, right? That was a thing that happened. And so that's an incorrect response. Me getting anxious because I'm walking alone at night and there's a guy who's crossed the road to walk closely behind me, anxiety is the absolute correct response in that thing. And I think this is where I want to
give you, when you say incorrect, and I don't want to put words in your emotions, but I also want to say
maybe not
like
incorrect,
adaptive, adaptive. So it's protective.
Yeah,
even
maybe
though
not
it's
incorrect.
It's not serving you in any way.
Yeah,
it's not actually keeping you safe. But I know totally what you're saying.
I'm glad that you've corrected me on that, because you're right. It's not necessarily incorrect, but it's not.
It's not adaptive.
Yeah. And it's not the response that you would be wanting to have in that experience. And in the same way, you know, when I had depression, there would be things that would happen that should be joyful, and yet I can't experience joy. So there's all these things. But I think when you can regulate your emotions so that a majority of the time you're having, you know, the expected, maybe we say expected response is better.
Yes.
It's the expected response. Something joyful happens, I feel joy. Something breaks a boundary or makes me angry, you know, that's okay, because actually that's, you know, the response that I would expect in that situation. And so then you can actually start to feel the plethora of emotions without feeling guilty or shame or, you know, those responses where it's like, well, I don't get angry because I'm like above it or whatever. It's like anger's a really helpful emotion.
Yeah, as long as you're not, as long as it's not destructive and ragey at someone else, right? Like,
but when do we get modeled a good, you know?
We don't. I don't think anyone is good at that. I don't think anyone models good, healthy anger.
No, I don't think I've ever seen it.
No, I don't think I've ever
How
seen
do you process your anger, just out of interest? Because I think this is a big one, especially for women, especially for women that experience trauma, especially for women that tend to lean on the freeze or fawn response. Feeling and expressing anger is terrifying and often very difficult to connect with.
And I label it as, I spend a lot of time being like, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated, I'm annoyed. I give it like every other word other than anger. So what I've started to do is I come back to that self-compassion. So it takes me a while to even label it as anger.
Yep.
And then when I do, I'm just like, oh, hello, anger. This is anger. I'm just labeling this as anger. And then I try to have a conversation with my anger about, okay, well, what do you need? And often it is that I haven't voiced something, right? Or a boundary has been crossed. And then I can have a self-compassionate conversation with myself about, is this something you need to voice? Is this a boundary you have to put out there in the world? Or can you also say, okay, that's just information. It's information and I can sit with it. And then I tend to do somatic stuff around it. So I tend to then work out or do yoga or do Reiki or do tapping or something like that to move that anger. Because I think as women, we don't. And unfortunately, we still live in a world where, you know, men's anger is scary to us, right? And men have the opposite. I also feel really, really sad and compassionate for men, because they don't get to be told they can be fearful or anxious or sad or cry. So they don't get the other side. So same as I get anxious about, I cry about every emotion. Lots of men get angry about every emotion.
Yeah, because it's what's acceptable within the social norms. I've got a very big couch with these sort of like big hefty feather-filled pillows, and I just like piling those up and just beating the living crap out of it.
Yeah.
If I get angry, that's what I do.
Yeah. And I think you made a really good point about joy as well, because I think when we had trauma, it also becomes unsafe to be happy.
Yes.
It's like, well, I don't know if I really want to go there. I don't know if I want to open up to that, because does somebody else have an agenda? Is it safe to feel? When is the other shoe going to drop?
Yes.
So the other thing about processing your trauma that I think is such a gift is being able to actually find your right to be content, your right to be happy. Right?
It's so true. And I think also there's an element of like, when you're reconnecting with your emotions, it can be really difficult to trust yourself around what you're actually feeling when you've been having an unexpected response to things for so long. And so when you start to become less hypervigilant, or you're able to actually relax, it can feel really uncomfortable for a period of time, because it's almost like it might not feel safe to let go of that hypervigilance, because it's been keeping you protected for so long. And so I think there's so many so many disconnects, and you've got to make those connections again until it makes sense to you. And also, when you look at like the makeup of emotions and feelings, there's only so many chemicals that we have. And so when you have that specific chemical reaction, if you've named that something, it might not mean what you've made it mean, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then we have societal ideas too, like boys don't cry and good girls don't get angry. And so then we also have ideas around that. And then we also, most of our families don't teach us how to emotional intelligence, and they don't know. And we definitely don't talk about how you can have conflicting emotions and multiple emotions at the same time, right?
And also what I find interesting is, like, when you do kind of emotional study stuff, there's multiple uncomfortable emotions. So sadness, disgust, anger, and fear being the 4 core roots. They spread out into all the plethora of emotions. There's only one happiness for the pleasant feeling emotions. So you've actually got like 4 to 1 chance of having something that feels unpleasant.
Now, if I can put a positive spin on this, because as you're saying this, I think too, but this is an important point about resiliency, because we can have lots and lots of really bad traumatic experiences, but if we have 1 or 2 amazing reparative experiences, amazing people in our lives, I actually don't think we need as much of the good stuff to go further with the good stuff. Like the good stuff goes further. It has more power, actually. Like, so even when you think about like, our shadow side, right?
Yeah.
But when we shine light on the shadow can't exist there. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes if we think about it as resiliency, yes, of course we want like joy and contentment and happiness and excitement and all those things that go within the happiness family. But I actually don't think it takes as much of those to give us that good hit of chemicals. Like those chemicals are actually more powerful.
And there's more of them. So when you look at the chemical makeup, all the unpleasant emotions are basically cortisol and adrenaline.
Yeah.
But then when you want to create like happy chemicals, you're looking at oxytocin, DHEA, serotonin, acetylcholine, which I always pronounce wrong. Sorry for people. Like, feel free to put in the comments. I know certain words you just can't say, is there? It doesn't matter how many times you practice them. And so you've actually got more chemicals that help you to feel good than chemicals that don't. So it's interesting.
And not to say that that's just, it's just easy, we can bypass and just get to happiness. Or this. No, because like
just get over your trauma, babe. I can't believe you're still talking about it. Just cheer up.
Because like it's profound, right? When we get derailed, it's profound.
Yeah, I saw I'm not always her biggest fan, but I think sometimes the way she describes things is really good. Is what's her name? Till Swan. And she was talking about trauma, and she was like, imagine that you saw someone who'd been in like a horrific car accident and they're all like bandaged up and in a wheelchair and stuff, and you're like, oh God, are you still going on? You know, like a year later while they're still trying to learn to walk, you're like, oh God, are you still going on about that car accident or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. And you're like, that's so true. And I don't know if you found this, but I experienced this, and I definitely have seen it in my clients as a repeated pattern, is that often when something was a long time ago, there's like a disconnect between realizing that could be showing up today, because it's like, oh my God, that happened when I was 5, it can't possibly be a thing now, or that thing happened 5 years ago or last year, it's not you know, it's not that serious, or things that people don't necessarily, you know, like divorce or you know, relationship breakups or that kind of thing.
These are traumas because they overwhelm our ability to cope. And like, we think, you know, oh, you know, it's a divorce, I didn't want to be with him anyways. Well, yeah, but a divorce,
but at one point you did,
you decide at one, and so you have to fall out of love with somebody, you have to separate a house. Like, it's not like a divorce happens over life. That's like a 3 to 5 year process of you being flooded with stress hormones, right? And so you're right, there's all these big T trauma, these horrific things, but most of us have lots and lots of little T traumas that just become this cumulative process. And you're right, we dismiss, it didn't when I was 5, but we all have parts. Like, we all need times where our 5-year-old needs tending to, or our 14-year-old decides to have a nice little, you know, teenage temper tantrum.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because so many people talk about inner child work. No one talks about the inner teenager.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
She mad. She's like pissed off.
And actually, you know, maybe as women, this is the only time we get to be like, we do have this period of time where we get to maybe own this angsty, broody place, right?
I don't know. I think I'm still there sometimes.
Oh, mine is for sure. I was full, like, grungy, gothy, you know, broody, black hair, and you know,
it's great to explore that though. What one thing do you wish you'd known, like, on your journey? It sounds like you've just had such an incredible healing journey that spanned multiple decades. You know, what one thing do you wish you'd known about healing trauma before you started your journey?
I wish I'd known that healing is a process that happens every day, and that it's constantly unfolding, and we're constantly doing, because we think it's something we have to work on, and then you're going to leave it, and then you're going to work on it again. So trauma is something, yes, we work on at times, and it's also how we heal in relationship every single day with others, with ourselves. I think I had this illusion that adulthood was this place you arrive at and you have the answers and you don't need to do anything about it. And I think it's just about, you're healing every single day. It's constantly, I'll be healing till the day I die. And that's fine. I'm actually excited about it now, because now I see then that healing could be exciting. For sure, at the beginning when I was healing trauma, it was scary because I had to sit with those emotions and learn how to be with it. And so I don't want to minimize that at all. But now I'm like, oh, let's do the next step, because the thing that comes on the other side of that healing is just, I just know myself even more. And I think just the more you get to know yourself, the more it's just
the payoff.
So
it's like the payoff for doing the work, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the equivalent of when you've been to the gym and then, I mean, I've never had this experience, but I've seen other people do it. But, you know, when you've been to the gym and you've got a 6-pack and you go, I did that.
Yes.
That's my nutrition and sit-ups game on point. And I think it's the same with trauma. It's like, oh, I managed to set that boundary where I couldn't set it before. This thing happened and I didn't cry. This thing happened and I didn't have a panic attack. This thing happened and I didn't get so anxious that I can't function. This thing happened and I didn't get so angry that I punched my fist through someone's face or a wall or whatever.
And I want to be 90 and learn and still be learning something new about myself.
Oh God, I don't.
Because I think
oh God, I'm hoping the healing's done like in the next 2. I'm like, I'm over it.
Yeah, but even if it's not healing, like I think it's just like, oh, and I learned how to set a boundary at 90, and I learned something else about myself, and I learned something else I could let go of. And I think there's so many things we don't even know about our brain and how it works in our personality. And I actually think this is one of the things for women, especially maybe as you get into your 40s and 50s too, there's this like, I am falling in love with myself and I'm unapologetic and I don't care as much. And it's just, that's a
Yeah.
nice place too.
It is really nice. And I think something that somebody shared, because I wanted to ask you about this actually, and I realised we're massively running out of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze this in because I think it's going to be gold. I'm not going to share their name because I don't know if they would want me to. And I haven't asked permission to share, but they put it on Facebook as a public thing. So I imagine it's not super private. But this person that I know had shared that they had a very traumatic event happen to them, and it's a big part of their story and their work and various things. And they shared that they're not going to share it anymore. They're not going to talk about the story anymore. They're not going to talk about the details of the story anymore. They're not going to talk about themselves as if they were this traumatized person who's now healed. They're just not, that's just not their story anymore, unless it's super relevant and specific to help somebody else, basically. And it kind of got me on this like thing of like, how many narratives and stories have I created about myself? Oh, I'm this girl, I've got depression, I think I've got ADHD, I've had these traumas that have happened that I've had to overcome. And like, I don't know, just in terms of even just like labeling yourself like business owner, woman, you know, whether you're a mother or not, you know, which I'm personally not at the moment, you know, all these different like narratives and stories. And actually, if meaning and story is so important to trauma, which I believe it is, because, you know, what you've made things mean and how you rewrite that can really help you to heal, then at what point do we, you know, is there a point where we can just let go of that narrative and say, you know what, I'm not going to do any more trauma work, I'm not avoiding it or whatever, but I'm going to focus mainly on joy or happiness or I don't know, curiosity, joyfulness, playfulness, peacefulness, whatever it might be, instead of consistently going back and healing. Could I go forward with, I'm going to face forward with joy in my heart and try and experience as much joyful, fun. I don't know. What do you think about it?
And I've struggled with, because it's a bit of a riddle in my head, because I totally agree that there's this point you rewrite your story, but it can't also not be your story. It is your story. That is what it is, right? And to me, I get all wrapped up in my head about it and going in circles, because even coming on podcasts and talking about it, I'm not talking about it because I'm like, I often wondered, like, well, especially with family and friends, they're like, oh God, is she still working through that? But I'm doing it because I want to share my story, because it illustrates, I can give myself as an example for how I see clinically as a therapist, how I understand it intellectually, and how I know it happens in the real world. And I think we can't banish our story either. I think we can change our relationship with our story. I think we can rewrite our story. And I think there's periods of times where we don't share it and we don't keep going along with it. But in my mind, it's also who I am, and I'm proud of it. And so I think there's also this statement too, that again, there's not really a good English language phrasing for this, where we say, but you know, I'm glad, I can't say that I'm glad it happened because it made me who I am. Like, cause I could have done without being bullied and sexually assaulted. Like I could have done without that.
If I could go back and choose, I might.
But what if that experience allows me to help other people heal in the world? What if that allows me to put a mess? So I think it's this both. I think maybe it's about your intention in sharing it, right? Like, is it, and I think we can, but I think we tell stories about ourselves and we put labels of our identity on ourselves, as you say, and we get to change the story we want to tell about ourselves at any point in time. I think this is why illness or things that just change out of the blue in life, or retirement, are so hard, because we've put this identity of, this is who I am. I'm my career, or I am my role as a sister, or I am my role as a wife, or like same as you, I'm not a mother, but like, I think we're so many things to so many different people.
Auntie or therapist or this or that.
And so this happens with therapists all the time. People are like, well, you can't possibly like have, you know, disagreements with people because you know everything. And I'm like, no, I'm messy. I'm messy, same as everybody else.
That's
right?
why we have our own therapist.
Yeah.
Plus supervision.
Or wounded healers, right? There's a reason why people do what they do, right? And so there's times where I want to let go of my trauma story and not keep banging on about it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it might help someone for me to share and to come out of the closet and say, I actually have no problem saying that this is my history.
Yeah.
And I'm not even flooded by talking about it right now.
And it's tricky, isn't it? Because I think there's certain things in my story that I notice, and anyone that's listened to me as a guest on other people's podcasts will probably have noticed this. Whenever I talk about depression and like how bad it, because I sort of forget, because it was so long ago now that I couldn't physically function from depression. Like even if it rears its ugly little head occasionally, I've got the tools now that it never gets to the point, or hopefully it won't. I can't guarantee it's never going to get to that point, but it never gets to that point where I can't get out of bed and brush my teeth. I can't, function at all. When I go back to that and I think back to like how hard that was, like even now it makes me want to cry, because I just think, oh my God, I can't believe that you went through that. And sometimes when people question me about it on podcasts, because I don't think about it that often, it was a long time ago, I've kind of dealt with a lot of it, it still elicits this like deep emotion. And then other things I can talk about till the cows come home, and it really doesn't elicit any emotion.
Because it's a part of you, right? There's a part of you that's and there's a time where that part ran the show.
Yes, she did.
And now she's healed enough that you can tend to her and say it's okay and tuck her away, right? Same with anxiety for me. Like I would still say that's the most, like, there's no way for me to really explain this anxiety it was just my state of being.
I think anxiety is worse than depression. I know you shouldn't like pit them off against each other, but honestly,
and they're so connected too, though, right? But it's hard for me to really profoundly now say that was just my baseline.
Yeah.
That was just who I was. And now
how did I get through life?
And I did honestly, like probably even 10 years ago, thought that's just who I am and that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah.
And now I'm like,
wow.
Okay, it comes to same. It's a part of me. It's there. It exists. I can pull her up.
Yeah.
Right. I can bring her into the room for sure.
Yeah.
But she's not my dominant. She's not my dominant protector anymore.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that narrative of dominant protector. That's beautiful. Because I've not heard that before. And I think that's definitely...
Because she kept me really safe. I'm incredibly grateful to her.
And that's the thing.
Incredibly grateful to her.
I always think, well, you're still here. So even though you went through all that stuff and you had all these like bizarre coping mechanisms because you didn't know any better, they actually worked, didn't they? Because you're still alive.
Yeah.
So you did all right.
And I am. I'm grateful to her. She kept me really protected. And she allowed me to control a bunch of situations that weren't in my control.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, beautiful. Is there anything else that you want to share? Anything that you wish you'd asked before we start to wrap up today's episode?
No, just that I love people. I have people would just seek me up and come find me and come share, because I think, as we were sharing at the beginning before we came on, just the podcast, it's just an ability to just share stories. And I think that's so important, and have a community and all those things. And I'm just so grateful, Rachel. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
And it's always seems weird to be saying like you can have fun talking about, trauma and anxiety and depression and all of these weird, quirky things we have to cope in the world. But it can, because we can get to this place where you can just own it loud and proud and laugh about it. And
absolutely. And I think, also remembering that even if you are doing trauma work, you can also have fun.
Yes.
Like the therapy sessions might not be fun, but like if you meet all your friends for, whatever, going to the pub, having a coffee, doing brunch, whatever you're doing, and you're laughing, or don't feel bad about that stuff. Because I used to feel bad.
Right. I did too. Right. And
I used to think like, oh God, I can't be sat here saying I've got depression and then I'm actually having a laugh with my mum over dinner or something. I'd be like, well, that doesn't add up. And it's like, nah, things run concurrently. You can be traumatized and still enjoy certain aspects of your life. You can be depressed and still experience joy at times. You can be super anxious and still experience relaxation and calm and peacefulness and clarity of thought. And
and you can relapse in things and get back on track again, right? And so it is.
I love that. I used that so much in my healing. Choose again. choose again. You know, when you're like, if I'm having a negative thought about myself, I can just choose a different thought. If I'm having like a really intense emotional response to something, I can try and choose a different response, or choose a tool that I know is going to help me release that emotion so then I can feel better. And it was just that thing that I just used to say to myself all the time, like, you can choose again, because it's so empowering. You don't have to wait until Monday or New Year's Eve or January the 1st or, you know, it's like, it doesn't matter what it is, what the behavior is, what the thought pattern is, what the emotion is. You can, in that moment, choose.
Yeah. And you might have to choose 700 times in a day. Because there are days where like, for some reason I'm going here, right? So you might have a negative thought and you say, I'm going to choose again. Yeah. And then it's back
I'm going
to
choose again.
Right? So I'm going to choose again. But then also getting curious when you get into this place of safety enough to say, okay, so why is that narrative showing up? Yeah. And also, whose narrative is it? Is it my narrative? Is it my grandmother's narrative? Is it society's narrative? Right?
I love questioning. I think, why do I have this? Who does it belong to? Mm-hmm. What does it need? Mm-hmm. What's it protecting me from? Who is it protecting me from? Mm-hmm. Asking yourself, you know, either is it or why isn't it, depending on the situation, safe for me to release this? And then if you're not sure why, you can ask, you know, is it safe for me? Might be a yes, safe for me to let this go. Is it safe for my family? Mm-hmm. No. Okay. Yes, so I can let it go, but I can't let it go because actually, and that's where these disconnects happen. And so then you can build that self-awareness of, is it safe for the world? Is it safe for my community? Is it safe for my work? Mm-hmm. And then you can start to like narrow it down to, okay, so this thing is protecting me only at work. And that's why I feel like I can let it go all the time, apart from when I'm in the office or when I'm with my family or whatever it is.
And this is what happens with when I come on and I share my story. My immediately thing is it's safe for me to share it, but I don't want to hurt my mom. And I don't want to hurt my dad. Yes. And so I'm often like, Mom, like, I'm not blaming you, or Dad, I'm not blaming you. I'm just like, I've worked through it. Right. Yeah. But again, there's the family rules too, right? Around like, I'm always like, I don't want you, because we also generationally going back, right? You have to be stoic. You have to not air the family stuff, right? Yeah. And so so when you say that, right, it's like, who is it for? It's safe for me to say, but might not be safe for someone else that I love to be able to hear that. And that's okay.
Then it's a different strategy. And this is the thing. So when people say like, just let it go, it's like, but there's so many different strategies for letting things go. And if it's safe for you to let go, and so but then you're like getting frustrated, like, well, why can't I let this go then? And then you realize, it's because it's not safe for somebody else in my environment or what have you. Then you can use a different strategy, and then you can, but the freedom on the other side, man. But anyone who's listening to this, like, the work is hard, I'm not going to lie, but the freedom on the other side is worth every tear, every fear facing, it's worth all of it. Thank you so much for being here. This has just been such a great conversation. I feel like I could talk to you all night. It's actually got dark outside while we've been talking.
And all day for me, because now the sun is up here, so it's all good.
Oh, great. It's like people on YouTube are probably going to just be seeing me slowly disappearing like into the darkness in the background. It's like no light on in my room. It's just my front light. It's like headlights in my face now. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to obviously put all your links and stuff in the show notes. But for people that want to get in touch, how do they find you? What's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, so I'm on most of the social medias at Illuminated Path Counseling. So I have a YouTube channel that has tips and tricks for different things, as well as on Instagram and Facebook, just around some of the stuff we talked about today. And I've got a couple really exciting self-study courses that you'll put in the links as well. But everything's probably the easiest is on social media, just at Illuminated Path Counseling.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to you guys, the listeners, as always. If you are watching on YouTube, please do click that little bell and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us to reach more people. If you're listening on your favourite podcast platform, I know there are so many now, I'm not even going to name them all, but please do click and leave us a review. 5 stars is obviously what you're going to be doing. But do be honest, because I like to hear feedback as well. So if there's things you think we can improve on, do let us know. But if not, not, then give us a 5-star review. Help us reach more people with this incredible knowledge that we share and these incredible conversations. And I'll be back with you very, very soon with another conversation. Much love.
We hope you've enjoyed listening as much as Rachel enjoys making this podcast. Why not share it with a friend in need of some heartwarming inspiration? And if you really love it, drop us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps us reach and inspire more people. Thanks for listening.